Tonight it's my pleasure to welcome John Patkau back to the podium in Hastings Hall. This is John's third time around as Lord Norman R. Foster Visiting Professor in Architecture. Together with Patricia Patkau, a 1978 graduate of our school, who is his professional and life partner, John Patkau leads one of Canada's most respected practices, with offices located in Vancouver. The Foster Chair was endowed by Norman Foster and his family. Norman is a 1962 graduate of our school, as many of you know, and he has always been an outstanding model for excellence in our profession. On many occasions, Lord Foster has acknowledged his debt to Yale, to the great teachers he encountered here, in particular Paul Rudolph, Serge Shamayev, and Vincent Scully, and in his own words, his debt to the studio atmosphere, which was highly creative, competitive, with the kind of can-do approach that has influenced and inspired his practice for more than 40 years. The Foster Chair is intended to attract top teaching talent to our studios, our advanced studios, and in particular to ensure the continuing presence at Yale of international visiting faculty. Yes, Canada is a foreign country. It is a profession, in a profession known for shameless self-promotion. John and Patricia Patkau stand out for excellence, quietly pursued. Known for its meticulous attention to the craft of building, Patkau Architects convincingly address a wide variety of programs and scales, from luxurious private residences to large complexes for education and health. Long before the idea of sustainability became embedded as a hallmark of responsible architecture, the Patkau Studio approached its work with an environmental sensitivity that was deeply examined but never stridently promoted, subsumed as it was into a commitment to architecture as a comprehensive enterprise that only really succeeds when it rises to the level of art. John Patkau holds a Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Environmental Studies, and Master of Architecture from the University of Manitoba. He has taught at the University of British Columbia since 1985 and has been a visiting professor at Washington University in St. Louis and at Harvard, where, together with Patricia Patkau, he was Elliott Noyes Professor in 1995. In spring 2009, he was Eero Saarinen Visiting Professor here at Yale. In spring 2011 and fall 2012, he was Foster Professor, a chair he once again holds. Please join me in welcoming John Patkau as he reviews the work in his partnership, originally titled Recent Work. That was a clever original title, but now retitled Work Play. John.
Thank you, Dean Stern. It's a pleasure to be back at Yale again this term. I'd like to present a number of projects this evening in which my partner Patricia and I have been engaged in the last few years. This is a sort of it's not a survey, it's a few selected projects from the recent past. And I've decided to divide the lecture into two parts. The first, a series of building projects, obviously commissioned by clients, but the second, a series of research projects, which in the main we initiated ourselves. And as Dean Stern mentioned, I've changed the title of the lecture, and I've changed the title to Work Play to reflect the strong duality in the nature of the two types of projects, both in terms of their intention and in terms of their circumstance. And I should say that the research component of the work that I'm showing is a very serious endeavor in the office. We, perhaps not the office in totality, but certainly Patricia and I spend a significant part of our time investigating these projects. They've, I think, contributed enormously to new directions in our work. And so I'd like to begin with some building projects, and let me get oriented here. And I should say that the building projects are characterized by some ongoing concerns which have been part of our work for quite a long time. We've been in practice for 30 years now, and these concerns have sort of evolved over time. From the outset, we looked at what we called the found potential of a project as a point of departure. By that, we meant those aspects of site, climate, building context, program, or local culture that would facilitate the development of an architectural form which was evocative of circumstance. The result of this approach is that individual projects often take on distinct identities in response to differing circumstance. And consequently, the formal relationship between our projects is loose at best. To us, this is an appropriate expression of the diversity within which we live. With time, we've come to understand that architecture arises from this diversity of circumstantial considerations only through a synthetic act of imagination. This act of imagination also can take many forms. For us, most commonly an expression of cultural purpose, of environmental response, and of construction and technology. The more inclusive the imagination is to the diversity of circumstances which surround the project, the more complete the work of architecture. And then there is the issue of craft. For us, craft is intellectual in the first instance. It is a construction of ideas, a rigorous set of relationships which form an armature for the ongoing development and elaboration of the project. Craft is also aesthetic, the product of the sensibility of mind and eye. And finally, craft is physical, the material product of mind and the hand's extension through technology. Like the act of imagination from which the architectural project is formed, I believe the more inclusive the craft, the more complete the work of architecture. So I'm going to begin the building projects with a presentation of 3 houses. I presented these houses as projects previously. I'm now going to present them as completed projects. And I believe that they, in their diversity, represent the nature of our practice and the fact that there is this strong response to circumstance which forms a strong differentiation between projects. And so the first project is on an island just off the west coast of British Columbia, Salt Spring Island, which is a very temperate place, beautiful climate, very much like Northern California. The site is a farm, a very small farm, which you see circled on the aerial photograph. And in plan here, you can see the configuration, which is largely a hay meadow. And I'm going to try and make this, oh, here it is. So what we have here is a residual line of fir trees. These are massive.
Use this, much better.
Okay, these are fully mature Douglas fir trees, which are a residual part of the evergreen forest that used to cover the island. Below, there is a cottage, barn, a few outbuildings, including a studio, and a cultural landscape, which has been constructed by a German resident who subsequently sold the property to my clients, which is characterized by fruit trees, by trees imported from Europe, by a very eclectic cultural landscape. So our approach was to try and find some way of organizing this larger site and introducing a larger new house to the project. And we did that by, first of all, taking the existing house and selling it to the neighbor up the road and just moved it down the road, and then inserted the new house, which is comprised of 2 parts, a main house and a guest house, and it has a very unusual proportion. It's 280 feet long, and the interior dimension is 16 feet. So the aspect ratio of this house is extreme. And then finally, we reinforced the cultural landscape by developing the orchard in a much more intensive way. The clients were very food-oriented and very garden-oriented, and so there was this significant program of reinforcing the cultural program. Here you see the plan in various forms, the roof plan, the reflected ceiling plan, and the floor plan. And a couple of things that jump out. One is obviously the aspect ratio, this extremely elongated plan where the rooms are simply lined up as a series of rooms. But if you look at the roof plan, you can see that there are 40 skylights in the roof. And the majority of these skylights do not penetrate into the interior. They simply illuminate the building envelope, the roof assembly of this house. And I'll explain briefly why that is so. And then there are very significant apertures which are completely opening. So this is an aperture that's 78 feet clear span, which is fully retractable. The climate here is extremely benign. During the summertime, the temperatures run in the mid to high 70s all the time. There's virtually no rain. And so the house opens up like a pavilion. So here is the building section, and you can see that the interior is held away with a significant distance to the exterior portion of the envelope. And there are skylights which shine into this void space. What that does is illuminate a translucent plastic interior. So the interiors that you will see are not drywall, which you might think by looking at them briefly, but they're actually all translucent plastic. So here is the interior elevation of the long opening, and here is the opening in actuality. And so the glass wall has been retracted into the sides. The roof assembly is skylit, and so the translucent plastic glows in patches, not unlike the patches of light at the base of the fir trees, and the entire interior opens up to the surrounding exterior, both to the native fir trees, which are on the south, or on the north rather, and the cultural garden on the south. So here the house is located in the context of those very large fir trees. Second growth since the Second World War, which shows you how quickly trees grow in British Columbia. And the house itself is characterized by a very dark color, which is intended to make it disappear into the shadows of the trees. Details such as these screen walls are used to pull out the quality of light and the changing light conditions as they move through the time of day, and also act as a screen where the retracted glass walls are stored. And so the opening from the exterior, the ends of the house have extremely extended cantilevers. This is a wood-framed house. The 78-foot span is a wood span. The 26-foot cantilevers on the end are wood cantilevers. So there's, from a wood construction point of view, it's an interesting and quite ambitious structure. On the south side, you have a walkway which connects the guest house and the main house. The cultural garden is to the right. There are similar openings on this side which look through to the fir trees on the other side of the house. This is actually an oven. There are 4 ovens in this house because of the interest of the clients in food and cooking. And again, you can see the interior is illuminated by the light shining through the skylights into the building assembly. There is artificial lighting in the same location to achieve a similar effect after dark. The 2x4 framing is evident through this translucent skin. Again, the shower opens up to the exterior to some Austrian sycamore trees. The passage between the main house and the guest portion of the house, and the guest bedrooms with loft spaces, and again, the effect of the light shining through the building envelope. The second house, and I should say that the 3 houses that I'm showing were all designed in roughly the same period of time, and so they reflect our preoccupations at a single moment and show the great variety of circumstances within which we're working. So this is located on another island. This is a northern island, so it has a much more extreme and violent climate than the house that I previously showed. It's on Quadra Island, which is just where the Strait of Georgia becomes a myriad of islands, and if you know the West Coast, the sailing in this area is truly spectacular. The house is located on a very complex site. There is a rock mound against which the house is located on the north, a phenomenal panorama of ocean to the east, a tidal pool to the south and a maple and fir forest to the east, or to the west rather. And here is the condition of the view toward the east. And the fifth view, I've often called this project the five-site project. The fifth portion of the site, which was very important in the conception of the design, is the beach below the site, which is littered with the debris that the storms bring onto the rock outcroppings here. And so there are floats and nets that come off of fishing boats. There are the logs that have been lost at sea with the logging industry, and even boulders which get thrown up onto this beach. And the beach is constantly being reorganized with every storm. And so the spatial idea of the house begins with the mound and the forest and the panorama to the east. Entering the site from deep inland, you move along the edge of the rock outcropping and through a series of spaces which are defined by low rock walls. And then there is inserted a series of concrete walls which channel the space through what will be the house and out to the ocean. Various sort of eddy-like spaces which are around the main flow space become the service spaces, bedrooms and kitchen and things of that nature. That center space gets filled with debris, like the debris in on the beach below, shards of concrete, patches of water, elements of furniture. And finally, a deck which is cantilevered off the rock cliff beyond the face of the rock toward the ocean, and the plan itself. And so the private rooms are all located around this central space which flows through. This is a view from the rock cliff above the house. The roof is an extension of that surface. There are often deer on the roof. It really functions as a continuity of that surface. Entering into the first court, which is the auto court where you bring and leave your cars, you have access to the space that we're in here, which is a carport. The climate is again, very moderate, and so aside from the winter rainstorms, the only need really is for cover. And then moving through into the next space, which is the space you walk into to enter the house. And here you begin to be aware of the interior spaces within the house. The walkway along the bedrooms that takes you from the carport to the main house. Looking through the channel of space all the way out to the ocean beyond. Various elements such as the rock wall, which peters out in this space. The building is clad entirely in a charcoal-colored fiber cement panel, which has been organized so that each panel is legible. And then into the house itself, which is organized around a large dining room, but it's not just a dining room. The clients have a foundation which is dedicated to environmental issues, and so this is also a meeting space. This is a meeting house as well as a residence. In fact, surprisingly, the clients live here in the wintertime and go further north in the summer because the weather is too nice. And so spinning off of this space, you enter into the kitchen, which overlooks the tidal pool, back through the space. Each of the concrete walls, and I should say that the people who built this house had never built architectural concrete before, and they built the best architectural concrete I've ever seen. It's just remarkable workmanship. And each of the concrete walls is projected through the roof as a skylight, which you see here. And so moving into the bedroom areas, again, absolutely meticulous construction. The bedrooms themselves are all oriented low to either the rock mound, which is to the north, or this bedroom, which is the third bedroom, which is slightly rotated, overlooking the forest descending down to the beach. Small spaces, all of these surfaces are acoustic surfaces, so that even though the interior of the house is very hard materials, the acoustic quality of the space is very soft because the ceiling is entirely absorptive. So here you are looking over Georgia Strait back to the mainland of British Columbia. There's even pieces of glass in the floor. These are extremely large double-glazed glass panes which are inserted into the floor, which give you access to the beach below, which is particularly amazing during the storms, which throw all sorts of things up onto the beach. Another piece of glass in the floor, and behind this projecting concrete wall is a small study space. And then moving through to the water side of the house, you can see here how the house is projected over the face of the rock. The glass openings that were in the floor are here and here. The decks on either end are what you see with the wood deck material. To illustrate how remote this house is, you'll note that there's not another single light in this image, and that's not Photoshop. There just are no dwellings in that area. This is the only house in that entire stretch of land, which posed a significant construction challenge because it's an extremely remote location. So the last house, again designed at a similar time, is in Whistler, British Columbia, which is, as you probably know, a ski resort. Enormous amounts of snow. 15 feet of snow in the winter is not unusual. And so the house is in many ways shaped by it. It's located in a in a subdivision. This is the house right here. Very tough context for us by virtue of the character of the adjacent dwellings, but also by virtue of the real estate imperative of Whistler, which is that land prices are very high, and the owner wanted to maximize the development. And so our instruction was very simple. He wanted the biggest house that was legally possible to achieve on the property. That posed the obvious issues of fitting it into the building envelope, but more challenging in Whistler is the need to design a house which sheds snow into locations where people and cars are not located. And so the roof is designed in a way to push snow around so that it doesn't go into the areas where people and their vehicles are. This was, from a design point of view, a new investigation for us. It was the completely three-dimensional project. The second house I showed you on Quadra Island has a very complex plan geometry, but beyond that, it's fairly conventional. This house was developed to maximize volume. We designed it entirely in small card models. And so what you see here is an array of the models that we used to develop a volume. Once we had developed a design, we developed a set of digital drawings, and then we printed the digital drawings to see how closely the digital representation matched the card models. And once we were satisfied that it was a good match, we proceeded with that. And so this is the final digital model of the project. There is virtually, except for some interior walls, there are no vertical walls in the project. And aside from the floors, and even some of them are sloping, there are no horizontal surfaces in the project. And so framing this project and documenting it became a significant challenge. It was only possible because of our ability to work in 3D and the ability of certain trades to construct in 3D. And in that regard, the house was framed in terms of its principal members with steel and heavy timber construction, which both of which industries are probably the most developed in terms of three-dimensional geometry. And so they were able to sort of stitch out the basic configuration of the house within which there was a wood structure infill. We made a few mistakes where we felt that we didn't need heavy timber or steel. We framed those areas in conventional wood framing, and getting those geometries right was almost impossible. The contractor really struggled. We came to understand that it would have been a much better investment to do the entire project as a sort of a steel or combination steel and glue lam frame to simplify the construction process. And so the house is constructed with a concrete box which allows a significant cantilever out over the slope because it's on a steeply sloping site, above which there is a frame which creates the upper structure with a wood infill, and within the middle of which is a sort of a tall roof space which runs through the project to bring light into the center of the project. And so here you see the building sections. This is the house, cantilevering out over the slope below. Sometimes the snow is up here. It's designed for enormous snow loads, and so the structure is unbelievably robust. Images of it. Again, this volume was constructed principally to maximize the interior space available within the zoning envelope that was provided. Again, there was a local bylaw which required that the building be clad in wood. This is a ipe, which is not a native British Columbia wood, but the only wood that was durable enough to both be walls and roof. And so the roof assembly is similar to the wall assembly and is capable of dealing with enormous snow loads. Geometry is, again, as I say, is extremely complex. The workmanship, again, was exceptional. There seems to be a tremendous body of craftsmen available in British Columbia for projects of this kind. Moving into the interior spaces in some ways are resultant spaces of the dictum to maximize building volume, but they're all very carefully formed to construct the right kind of emphasis and to make the right kind of relationships to the surrounding context. There's a very long bridge which spans from the master bedroom, which is entered at this point, across to the study, which is located here, and then finally the study. And in areas such as this where we overlook a neighbor, the wood screen runs right over the windows, but has been serrated to construct a more transparent area. And so I think that the fact that those three houses, which most, I think, people wouldn't recognize as coming from the same office, but all reflect our interests, are really driven by the response that we're making to not only the environmental circumstances of the project, but the cultural circumstances of the project. I also showed three projects in my last lecture at Yale, which were competitions that we had won. Two of them have subsequently been constructed, or they've just been completed this fall, and so I'm going to show those. The first is the Fort York National Historic Site, Visitor Center in Toronto. Fort York is a historical fort from the late 17th and 1800s. It was the site of an important battle between the Americans and the British, which instigated the British raid on Washington, which resulted in the burning of the White House, which was Canada's only major war accomplishment. The fort itself is an extremely modest endeavor. It was constructed in the late 1700s. It was located at the edge of a creek called Garrison Creek on the narrow of Toronto Harbor, which was then York, and now is sitting below a freeway about 500 meters from the water. So the entire waterfront has been filled in, and what was just a little finger of land has been filled in for a municipal airport. The result is that a space which is viewed as being the origin of the city of Toronto is now a small, forgotten place underneath the freeway. Very challenging location, and the intention of which was to somehow reintroduce this fort to the city to make it accessible and acknowledge the importance that it has as part of local history. And so here is the fort. The space that we're standing in looking toward the fort is called the Common, and this is the site of the battle between the British and the Americans. The fort is protected by low berms, and then there are some buildings inside. A very, very sort of modest effort where basically it really is a small mediation between the two forces that are engaged in the battle. A site characterized by sort of a fluid, rolling landscape. And that sort of fluidity, that kind of almost pastoral landscape, and the fact that this was at one time on the shore of Lake Ontario were important aspects in the development of the project. And so the first thing that we decided to do was to construct an edge. There is a slope of land at this location, and this is the only part, the freeway is not shown in this drawing, but the freeway is actually running right along here. This is the former lakefront, shorefront. And so the notion is that we would reconstruct the edge, both of in a metaphorical way, both of the lake and of the fort. And so here is our site, not the most auspicious of sites. And this is the beginning of one of the sketches from the competition, sort of the idea of a barricade, a long palisade of weathering steel panels behind which and below grade, below the common above, the visitor center would be located. And so the plan is, this is the pathway of the freeway, which is running through here. The building is located in the zone between the freeway and the undisturbed soil above. The undisturbed soil above is an archaeological site which is being worked. And the only place in which we could locate the building without interfering with the archaeological site was in the spoil of the freeway construction. So basically that part of the site that was disturbed by the construction of the freeway is where we located the building. The building, as I said, is basically subterranean, located below the common. So this is the battlefield here. This is the freeway. This is the extension of the common with our weathering steel wall. And then the space below the freeway is part of a very important series of spaces in Toronto right now, which is the subject of a great deal of discussion because of the fact that this freeway cuts off the lakeshore from the city and has significant spaces under it. And so one of the important things that the project began to address is how to occupy this space and turn it into a positive public space. And so we decided that we would reinvent this space as a metaphor of the lake. It's planted out in grasses and irises and water-related plants and has within it walkways and large decks for outdoor events which are raised above the existing grade so that they're almost dock-like in their construction. And so here you see one of the images from the perspective of the visitor center. Wherever there are large openings, the weathering steel panels have been tipped up into space, and the space below the freeway has been developed into an important public space. The plan, which I won't go into in detail, has a major lobby. It has a variety of multi-purpose rooms. Not only is it a visitor center for the fort, it is also a community center for the local population. And so it has a lot of multi-purpose uses. But there is also an important exhibit space, which is to extreme gallery standards, which are located here, and an administration area for the operation of the fort. One of the interesting things about the brief that of the competition was that there was to be what was described as a time tunnel, which would lead you from the visitor center to the fort. And in our project, we proposed to develop a ramp that would run through an audiovisual experience and take you from the lower level within the visitor center up to the upper level of the common, which you see here. So taking you up and out to the upper level, again in section here. What we found was that there was another possibility, which was that this would become a scrim onto which audiovisual could be projected to represent events of the history of the fort, but also to support other public events. Well, we won the competition, actually, this is the plan leading you up and back to the fort. And the project was delayed for a while, and then ultimately we began to develop it. And we have finally just constructed the core of the project, which you see here. So this is the beginning of the weathering steel embankment. There are extensions which are yet to be constructed on either side. The foreground, which will ultimately be landscaped and have these large raised plazas for events, will be coming hopefully next year. The scrim and projection is a victim of the budget struggles that we had on the project, and even the fact that the project is currently incomplete in terms of the landscape and the interior development is a function of some of the budget struggles we had. But Toronto was blessed by the presence of Rob Ford as mayor, and this project was developed entirely during his tenure. And so it was an interesting experience. So here you see the time tunnel emerging as a long triangular channel glass facade. But here the panels which are tipped up to make connections either to the common above or to the building interior. These are 8 feet by 24 foot by 3/4 inch thick weathering steel panels, which are either clipped onto the face of the building or are supported on beams and a large torsion member, which you can see coming through right there. Phenomenal material. There is such material presence and gravity to this. And surprisingly, the opening was about a month and a half ago, and surprisingly, the public reaction to this material, which I was concerned about, has been extremely positive. So, I mean, that's really interesting. This is some of the final landscape that will be taking place. This was in a week at the time of the photograph, but it's a combination of sea grasses, irises, and things of that nature. Temporary walkway, which will become a large wood deck, what we call the events dock. Some of the spaces which are open by virtue of the rotated steel panels. And then the interior, which has yet to be, where the installations have yet to be complete. The lobby, the beginning of the access to the time tunnel rising above the major gallery space. The second competition which we won, and these were at the same time, is also in Toronto, and it's at the University of Toronto, and it was a hybrid project which combined the Goldring Centre for High Performance Sport and a students' commons for the university. And so there was within it a field house to support high-level basketball and volleyball, important strength and conditioning center, a major research component, as well as a student center, which represented another of the large spaces within the interior. And it has a very interesting site. It's located across a very small street, which is closed for events from Varsity Stadium, which is the track and field and football stadium for the university. And Varsity Stadium has a grandstand on one side only. And so the notion is that we would construct spaces which would take advantage of the openness on the west side of the field for overlook. And so here is the situation. There is a pedestrian student lane kind of walkway along here, a street that can be closed, important cross connections through our site. A future tower, which I'll talk about in a little while, which we're currently developing on the north end of the project. And so here was the university's expectation. There would be a large basketball, volleyball field house, which would have 2 courts, one of which is a competition court and practice court, the other strictly a practice court. This would be an extending stands, which would cover the practice court during events, and so there would be seating on both sides of this court, and there would be a clear span over this entire area. The university also wanted to put a tower on top of the field house. And in our proposal, we decided that that was a structurally ambitious thing that we could avoid. And we decided to avoid it by organizing the field house differently. We decided that we would use modern technology in the form of LED game lines to reorganize the court in such a way that you could have both the competition court and the two practice courts within the same space and avoid the need to project beyond the site of the project to below the tower. And then above that, we located the student center, the strength and conditioning center, and then a small research hub above that. As I said, the competition court looks like this with seating all around, and it's very interesting because we did this. Ultimately, we were selected for the project, even though it was in violation of the rules of the project, which is the perversity of competitions. More likely than not, the winner has broken a rule, an important rule somewhere. And in this case, when they saw the perspectives of this space with people 360 around the competition court, they said they had to have that. And by breaking the rule, this is the practice courts, and this was our strategy. And it's very interesting that since we made this proposal, the technology of LED lighting for game lines has now become mainstream. And so that possibility exists. So the notion is that you would enter the sports facilities from a lobby on the south and the student center from a lobby on the north. This is the 360 seating, which proved to be instrumental in the organization and selection of our project. Not only that, unlike the university brief, we raised the gymnasium so that there is clear story lighting all the way around, which can be blacked out, but which allows you to, from the student lane and from the street and from the two lobbies on either end, to overlook the basketball court. And it's really quite amazing. The lane is only about 20 feet wide, and you look into this enormous space. It's a real inversion of expectation. And so going to the student center, moving up on the north lobby to the student center, interestingly enough, the students who were not really part of the selection process or part of the mandate for this project ultimately decided that they didn't want to be part of the project. And so when we moved forward, and this is the Strength and Conditioning Center, again, overlooking the field. When we moved forward, they said there's no way they wanted to be in a university, in a multi-purpose university building, because inevitably the university would take over their space, and they wanted to be in a standalone. And so what we decided to do in that regard was to, and as a result of some significant budget issues, we removed that part of the project. We really consolidated the research into a single floor, and so we were able to get a much more compact and much more cost-effective structure, which allowed us to move forward with the project, except for the wrinkle that the tower, which was supposed to be here, which we had so carefully avoided, was compromised by the redevelopment of a historical building at this point for a very important donor for the university. The donor, to make this building work, they needed, like Rudolph Hall, they needed to add exit, access, and mechanical to the building, which they decided to do in this location, overlapping the footprint of the proposed tower. The argument that they made was that these components could be treated as temporary, and that at some future date when the tower went forward, they can be removed. How you remove the elevator system, the mechanical system, and the safety exiting from a building was something that was not discussed and obviously not practical. And so we were then charged with how do you now solve the problem of the tower? And not only that, the tower was held away so that trucks could get in here to provide service to these four buildings. And there was only one solution possible, which was to construct a turntable, and trucks drive in and they get turned around to deal with all the servicing from these various buildings. And not only that, this turntable structure had to be designed in such a way that it could support a tower of some undescribed future character. And so the building that we were asked to design now had a little doghouse on the back of it, which had to set itself up to support a future tower. And not only that, the future tower sat on part of the large span trusses for the field house. And so here is the project under construction. In order to deal with the clear span of the spaces below, the building is actually hung from a bridge above. And so under construction, this is the field house, and here you see all of the floors above the field house, which are just levitating above the space, being hung from these enormous trusses, which ultimately will, and which we're now commissioned to do, to construct a tower on top of. And so here is the project across from Varsity Field. This is the Sports and Conditioning Center, which you see here. It's just opened, and so we were lucky to get in and get a few photographs of the project. And here you are overlooking the field house. Okay, so part two. I should say that our office has always been engaged in architectural research. In the olden days, when Tim was in our office, the research that we took on had to do with formal analysis. And so we would build models like this one, like this, which Tim directed, and this one, which Tim and I designed together, which were fragments of projects that we designed with the intention that they would be developed in such a way that they would bring forward the formal characteristics of those projects in exaggerated and perhaps more legible in a perhaps more legible manner. Since that time, and actually coincident with my teaching at Yale, we have radically transformed the research that we've been doing. What we now are doing is full-scale material-based research, which looks at the effects of material manipulation in terms of developing spaces and structures. And so the first is a project which we were invited to participate in, which was to provide some shelters on a frozen river in Winnipeg, which is the city in which I grew up in, that would be merely wind protection for the extreme climate. And the hypothesis of this project and all the subsequent projects is that if you take a material, either the net on the red net or the piece of plastic, and deform it in some way, on the one hand with a chopstick, on the other hand with an elastic band, you begin to develop structure and you begin to develop space. And so we, in designing the shelters for the river, we decided to work initially in model form, but we found that we were really unable to proceed very far this way because, in actual fact, we needed to be working with the material from which we would be making these things. And so we moved immediately to full size, and we found, to our surprise, that even the thinnest of plywood didn't do what we needed to do, what the model had suggested that we would do. The thinnest of plywood had very little ability to bend, partly because of the fact that it's essentially an isotropic material that is equally strong in both directions, and it wasn't large enough to construct the volumes that we were attempting to make. And so we ultimately sourced a material called bendy ply. Bendy ply is an anisotropic plywood. It is very weak in one axis and strong in another, which allows you to bend it in one axis very radically. It's made of very, very heavy outer plies in one direction and very thin inner ply in the opposite direction. And what we found was we could laminate various layers of bendy ply to make larger ply. And so we were then able to make much bigger pieces out of these multiple layers and still have material that had the ability to bend. And so here we are working full size in the shop within our office. Here you can see what kind of curvatures that we were able to get out of this material, and the fact that we had two layers allowed us to provide some interesting detail conditions, and here is the full-size mock-up. This was designed simply by working directly with the bendy ply at full size. Ultimately, what we did, and you'll see in a moment, so here's the mock-up. A number of details were tested, tried, changed, replaced, and ultimately we were able to develop the mock-up. The perforations that you see reflect the fact that there's only a single layer of bendy ply in that location. And here again, you can see how small-scale detailing of these multiple layers. And so what we did was we built it, we took it apart, we measured it, we made drawings, which you see here, of this, working in exactly the opposite manner that we normally work as architects. Even all of the connections, this is the base, which is a timber base. This is the back spine and the roof spine, which tie these sheets together. These are the pieces that go together to form these elements. Unpredictable shapes because they were simply cut to achieve the volumes that we wanted to create and then opened up. And we even studied, and again, now going back into model form, the notion of how these might be clustered. And so we have the cluster and then the fabrication. And so it was fabricated 1,500 miles away from our office in this garage. And the project architect from our office went to the site to see how they were coming, especially in response to a telephone call which he received, which had to do with this, which had to do with the fact that there were some surprises. And when he got there, he realized that what had happened was they had ordered material that was twice as thick as the design. They thought they could get it for the budget, it would be better. But this is what happened. To solve that problem, and this kind of problem is not an unusual building experience, to solve this problem, what we decided to do was to weaken the plywood in the areas of greatest curvature. And so in areas like this, which really fold around, we simply scored the inside of the sheets between the two layers. We had to trim some of the shapes, which we couldn't develop as much curvature as we wanted, and we had to reinforce some of the really stressed locations with sheet metal. The net result of all of that was that we got it built, and in some ways the added thickness made it increasingly more robust. And so here it is out on the river. These photographs were taken by a very dear friend of mine who has done most of our photography, and it was 35 below when he was shooting this. And he was trained by Ansel Adams as a landscape photographer. And so it's all tripod work and everything, you wait for the perfect light. And so he was out in the field at 35 below, sitting behind his tripod doing these things. Well, that didn't last too long. Very shortly into the adventure, he threw the tripod away and became the most hated of photographers in his lexicon, the go-go photographer who points and shoots. And nevertheless, he was able to point and shoot quite a number of beautiful photographs for us. And not only that, he hung around to wait to get the key shot, which is at 40 below in the evening, which was well worth the wait. Well, this work was all taking place during the second term that I was teaching here, and I was teaching a studio which was located at the Eli Whitney Workshop and Museum just north of New Haven. And the director of the museum, William Brown, said to me, you know, have you seen this video called Between the Folds? It's all about origami. He said, I really recommend that you see it. And I said, oh, okay. I had never really thought about origami. The idea of folded birds had not interested me. But I got the video, and there was one guy in the video whose name is Paul Jackson, who is in Israel. And he related the anecdote where he was asked by a student whether you can make origami with one fold. And he said, no, you cannot make origami with one fold. Everybody knows it takes 1,000 folds to make an elephant. But he began to think about that, and he decided to investigate the possibility of origami with one fold. And this is origami with one fold. And when I saw that, I thought to myself, this is remarkable. How can we use this to make structures? And so we played with paper in our office, trying to master origami, developing all sorts of different forms. And ultimately, we went into our little shop, and we took a piece of 24 gauge sheet metal, basically flashing or duct metal, and we scored a line on the metal, and we folded it, and we cut a hole in the middle of that score before we folded it, so that we could force the thing and pop it around. And this is steel in origami. And I took this piece of steel to a number of steel fabricators in the city, and I said, can you make this big? And they said, absolutely. What we'll do is we'll cut it into pieces, we'll roll the pieces on our rollers, we'll weld it all back together again, and you'll have that thing. And I said, no, I don't want that. I want to get the form that comes out of the process of bending it, of folding it. And they said, no, steel doesn't work like that. Paper works like that, but steel doesn't work like that. So we said, okay, we'll take that on. And so I had two really, really talented young guys in my office who helped me with this, and we began to invent machines that would bend steel like origami. And so ultimately we made 6 machines. We started out with, this is machine number 2. It's a very small machine. We were still bending flashing metal at this point. And here you see some of the process where we bended the metal. We went through 6 machines. This was 2 people's work for 4 months. The research is not a modest endeavor. And ultimately came to this machine, number 6, or number 5, number 6. And here you see it almost consumes the entire studio, or courtyard outside of our studio. This is a 5 by 12 foot sized 16 gauge, 18 gauge sheet of stainless steel. So it's a very big piece of steel. We have a machine that's big enough for it, and we began to bend it. And the trick about our machine is that it's broken in the middle. And so as we start tightening the bolts, which drives the 2 pieces of wood together, if we had a shop, it wouldn't be bolted, it would be a hydraulic press, but we didn't have that. But as we do that, we raise it, and the break itself tapers from a deep break to no break at the center. So there's really no depth where this fold is. The metal is still flat there. And that's the secret to this. By folding it more here and virtually not at all there, and by bending it as we're raising it and tightening it, we're able to get this form, which is this. And these curves are completely natural curves that spring from the bending operation of this metal. And so this was a different material and a different technique, but the same operation as in the skating shelters, which is basically sprung form, where the material itself takes on the curvature that it wants to take on as a result of the forces that are applied to it. And then we projected this project, which was where we took the 5 by 12 sheet and applied the same forces to a 24 by 10 sheet, so 100% larger, and you get this. And it's actually a very robust structure, because not only is a broken angle, it's got the arch shapes as well. So it's very, very stiff and a surprisingly powerful natural form. Shortly after finishing that work and being quite excited about the result, we got a call from Comme des Garçons, from this person, Ray Kawakubo. And Ray is a famous fashion designer. Here she is with the dark glasses and the whole 9 yards. A very extreme fashion designer who is always on the edge, who owns Comme des Garçons. There are a variety of outlets, and she said that she was opening a new store in Ginza in Tokyo, and she loved the skating shelters, and she wanted us to build some things that she could use for display or for change rooms or something in her new store in Ginza. And we said, okay. And she said one thing: it has to be fireproof, because in Tokyo, fire is a huge issue. And so we said, no problem, because we are steel masters. And so we developed this scheme, which is basically taking 2 of our one folds and tying them together. to form this structure, which would act either as a display structure or as a change room with a suitable modesty curtain. She said she didn't like it. And she said she didn't like it because it was too artistic. And I thought, how can something be too artistic? But what can I say? So she said she wanted something more like the skating shelters. And so, okay, well, the client is king, I guess. And so we decided to try and explore steel in a different way. And so this is the design that we developed. And I should say that these are plastic. Those are, their models are about this big, and they're made out of sheet plastic, and they behave exactly like steel. They're completely predictive of the forms that the steel sheets generate. And so we looked at how we had accomplished this, measuring from the full-scale wood. What we decided to do was to measure from the tiny scale plastic and develop forms. And here you see the patterns that we developed off of those tiny plastic models. And you can see that the patterns are beginning to become increasingly fluid. They're becoming more like clothing and less like architecture. In fact, these are the fold lines, which this piece is tied to that piece. And so it goes together very much like clothing, like seams. And the formal language, which again is something that we take off the model, and we develop with all the bits and pieces that we learned about doing the wood one to make them out of steel. And so our commission was to design and fabricate and deliver these from Vancouver to Tokyo. And so here they are being fabricated in Vancouver. We were lucky to get a great group of people who were really interested in this, and we began building these things in the shop. There were some interesting adventures en route. Many of the details that we developed worked out perfectly, some of them not so much. The first problem was we knew that there would need to be some attention paid to the edge because it was quite thin, and we were concerned not only about the ability of somebody to cut themselves on the edge, but also what we learned in this process was that in these very, very thin steel shells, the edge, and I think this is true in all shells, the edge is where the power of the shell structure comes to an end. And in a sense, the weakest point in a shell is the edge. And so typically what we found was you had to reinforce the edge. And so the notion was that we'd take a simple band of plate and attach it to the edge, and that would accomplish the job. What we quickly came to understand was this thing is constantly twisting in space. And so a flat bar could not do that. And we were perplexed until the simple idea of attaching a rod to this edge. So we tacked on a 1/2-inch steel rod, and then we ground it out. And this is the edge condition that we got, which was quite amazing because it takes this unbelievably thin sheet and gives it this soft, very sensuous edge condition, which you see here. We also had to make one of them into a change room, and so we were having great difficulty, and this is where we blew the budget, because they were building this thing on the shop floor before we'd figure out the door design. So we quickly built a wood version of this thing in our shop and tried various kinds of doors, but nevertheless, we slowed them up in the shop floor and ultimately paid the price. But this is the door, which is a fabric over a steel frame, which is in one of the two shelters. And finally, because it was an interior space with no natural light, we illuminated the interior with a translucent floor, which you see here. And so we had to put it all together, but not only that, because it was going into a shop in Tokyo which didn't have access from a service elevator, we had to take it apart on the street in Tokyo, carry it up in little pieces up the stair, and reassemble it in the shop. And so one of the problems was that the pieces that we had made were bigger than the stairway that we could carry it up in Tokyo. And so how do you break it down? So here it is, broken down in pieces, and the secret to that is this right here. What we found was that there was one place where there was a straight line on the face of the curving plane. And at that point, we made a cut and we made a fold, and then we could make a joint. And so we could break that large piece down into two pieces. And that ability of that straight line, that ruled surface, became very instrumental in subsequent projects. And so I'm just going to blow through these things, but it was quite a little piece of industrial design. And the end result is remarkably monumental, sort of enigmatic form. And not only is it have a monumental appearance, it has an unbelievably robust surface. Even though it's very thin material, the curve shape and the edge conditions turn it into a very, very tough thing. And here it is in the shop. So moving from the notion of that to our real objective, which is to make these research projects architectural in scale, to get them big, we began to look at the whole notion of ruled surfaces and what that could develop. And so as a hypothetical project, we developed the notion that we would design two retaining walls which would construct a cut through the landscape, joining two pieces of parkland that was separated by topography and vegetation. And what we did was we decided that the configuration of these retaining walls would be undulating intensely at the bottom of the wall and undulating in a very gentle curve at the top of the wall, so that we would have an inherent structural strength through the shape. And the idea was that we would make a series of triangular trusses, which here you see them all lined up, and each one is just a triangle with some cross framing between. And onto those trusses we would make some CNC cut guides, onto which we would lay in a whole series of 2x4s. And these 2x4s would simply be sitting in the guides, and onto that we would add reinforcement and gunite. And so we would form basically a swimming pool type structure on this, and then simply remove the wood structure from the interior, and these are the spaces and the robust structure that results from the undulating geometry and the single-sided formwork, which acts to construct this space, and shows sort of the power of simply taking dimensional lumber at a large scale and using it through a very simple mechanism like a ruled surface. Having done that, we then said, well, how do we start scaling up the metal that we're working on? And we had taken our machine and gone to fabricators, and they've always resisted using our machine because they don't believe that they can predict and control the outcome. And so we decided to go back to a much more rudimentary idea, which is that you simply fold steel in a conventional break, so that any of these forms can be made in any shop simply by folding pieces of steel and joining them together. And using this idea, we could then start stacking them, which you can see over here, and construct tower-like forms. And the notion was that we would then construct something, and we said, well, let's call it cooling station. The idea was that there was a foundation which was isolated from the ground so that it was the earth temperature. There was a reflective stainless steel tower, which is painted black at the top and grading to reflective at the bottom. We would then have some thermal sink embedded in a double layer at the top. And so the combination of the radiant cooling and the stack that we create would construct a completely passive cooling station for hot desert conditions. And so this is the design that we developed, all in the interest of constantly finding ways in which we can begin to scale these things up to get into building size. Currently, we're working on a project for a friend of mine who used to teach architecture at the University of British Columbia, and he wanted a place just to have a drink in his garden. And so we took our one-fold machine. We said, well, here's the sucker. Here's somebody who's going to go spring for the one-fold machine. And so we developed this form using one-fold elements. And I know Andrew's got tons of cash, and so why couldn't he do this? And so we took this design to metal shops, and they said, no problem, we can do this for you. We'll cut it into pieces, we'll roll it, we'll weld it all back together, and it'll only cost $150,000. Well, Andrew didn't go for that. And so we went back to the drawing board and we decided that we would go back to this notion of simply folding simple sheets in a conventional way, in a simple steel brake. And we began to play. And so the first one we did had a fold and a fold, tie these two sheets together and tie it to the ground. And we began to introduce a third fold to try and get some more structural behavior. We went through a whole series of these things, ultimately coming to this guy, which has some important conditions. The folds that are attached to the ground are very important structural components. These two folds form a triangle, which becomes an incredibly robust structural element. And this is made of very, very thin material, so it's unbelievably floppy. If you can take it and just shake it, and it just goes like almost like a sheet of paper. And so that was the beginning. Here are two sheets. They're made of the garden gnome that we ultimately developed is made of 4 sheets of 5 by 12 stainless steel, 16 gauge. Each sheet has 3 folds, which you see here. The folds are turned into this sort of Z-shaped figure. When you put those two together in this situation, and then you fold them back on themselves and attach them to the ground, they give you this figure. And when you take 2 of them and you nest them, and then you take the unreconciled point at the top and pull them together and weld them, that introduces a stress which brings the top of the structure into tension so that the robustness of the triangle at the bottom is not equaled, but is approached by this added stress that's been added. And so then you get this element, which we were able to build for $30,000, which was Andrew's upset limit. And so 3 folds, 4 sheets of steel, and you get this form. Okay, last project. This was an ideas competition. One of the students here that was in my studio, Jackie Howe, was a member of our team working on this project. The idea was that we would take the forming system that we'd used for the rift and turn it into a structure. And so what you see is that each piece of wood is simply moved slightly in plane, and so you get this form. So this is made entirely out of straight pieces. These are steel cones at the top, but all of these curved surfaces are made entirely of straight pieces. They are a remarkable structure because they are scabbed together with these joints, and they're made of regular modules of wood, so they're all made out of very conventional lengths, and they begin to act as a shell. And the key to this structure, unlike joists or beams where wood is limited in its span by virtue of its depth, here we're limited in span by virtue of the curvature of the overall shell. And so we begin to get some remarkable spans, really remarkable spans, and the ability to do some very interesting things which have a remarkably three-dimensional quality made entirely out of straight sections. And so here are the plans. It was a small branch library. So there's a reading terrace, an auditorium. This is the reception desk, some offices and back of house. The stacks above and a mezzanine above that. And this is the section through the building. And you'll note when you look at the sections that in one direction the sections are made entirely out of straight pieces. And that's because those sections are cut perpendicular or parallel to the members which make up these shapes. And so again, everything is straight. But as soon as you rotate 90 degrees and you make a cut through this form, you get these remarkable curvatures and curving planes, which come simply out of the function of the slight adjustment of adjacent members of wood. And you can see that these shapes begin to become very significant structures. That is a very robust dome. And so we don't need beams that span from here to here because we have a shell. We have a shell that does that. And so you're able to do enormous structures using wood in a completely efficient way. Another of these sections. Our projection for the exterior was cementitious coating and ceramic tile. In retrospect, I don't think that's the best solution for this material. I think a metal shingle is the most natural cladding system for it. Here you can even see that this system allows you to rotate planes out to construct gill-like openings from the interior to the exterior. And so some of the perspectives of the interior of this space, again, all of these are reciprocal structures made of small, short members, all tied together to function as a shell. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Will you take some questions?
Sure.
All right, we have some questions for our speaker tonight. Takes a minute. Such quiet. Are you intending to realize this project? I'll ask.
It was an ideas competition.
Idea, but now
Yeah,
that
I'm looking for a client.
I,
If there's anybody here who would like to have one of those, we're looking to do that.
well,
I should say that we have about 4 other research projects ongoing in the office right now, which are exploring quite different operations. Some of them are surprising, and if it wasn't for intellectual property concerns, I would share them with you, but we're actually beginning to get to understand that this activity is taking so much of our time that we've got to start making it pay for itself.
well, I was going to ask that as a simple capitalist that I am.
Yeah, well,
Who's paying for all this?
exactly. Nobody's paying for it. That's a problem. But the notion is that this is all scalable. It all goes to architectural scale. It all can be applied to architectural projects. Yes.
There's a question. We'll get the microphone to you, please.
Hi. I just wanted to ask what inspires you to start these research projects, because they're quite different from one another.
Yeah. It's a combination of things. In the first instance, my partner Patricia was a full-time professor at University of British Columbia. So she was in the office a couple days of the week, but she was teaching the rest of the week. And about 4 years ago, when we began, just before we began these things, she decided that she was going to retire from full-time teaching. And when she did that, I said, great, because we need you. I'm really happy that you're going to be in the office all the time. And she said, hang on, I'm not coming into the office any more than I currently am. I'm using that time to do something worthwhile. Well, I don't know what that means. But anyway, and so the first thing that she did was she responded to the invitation that we'd be given to do the Winnipeg skating shelters. And she began playing with it. And the second she began playing with it, boy, I was there. Because it looked like so much fun, and James, who was the project architect, was in there right away as well. And it immediately became something that the office was really enthusiastic about, and the potential for it was obvious. So her sort of refusal to accept sort of the grind was one part of the impetus for it. The other part was the reason why she refused simply to come into the office full-time was because of the frustration that we have, and I think most practicing architects have, with the challenges of practicing architecture. I mean, it's filled with frustration. It's filled with challenge. I mean, you've got budgets that are always too low. You've got clients who always make the wrong decision. You've got building officials, and I know there's a building official here who's always giving you grief. But there is, and it's really interesting. A very good friend of mine who was trained as an architect and who worked for me briefly. He has now got an industrial design practice, and he was playing back and forth between industrial design and architecture. And he's a totally engaging guy, and he could sell anybody anything. And so he could be a tremendously successful architect. But he said, you know, when I do industrial design, the only thing I hear is yes. Every time I propose something, they say yes. I would do that. I'd you see that? Yes, please. And he says, when I'm an architect, everything I always hear is no. You can't do that for this reason. You can't do that for this reason. You can't do that. So there is this problem, and we have not abandoned architecture as a practice because the rewards are sometimes worth the effort. But the ability to develop your own project, and that's why I made the distinction at the outset of the lecture that the building projects are commissioned by clients. The research projects are often something that we simply invent. We get to decide when it's good enough. We get to decide what it costs. We get to decide all of those things. And the freedom that has given us has been, and the gratification that we've gotten from it has been remarkable. And I think, in a sense, it hasn't undermined the architectural practice because unlike my friend who's the industrial designer who says, no, architecture is too frustrating. For us, it's really energized the architectural practice because we now see a whole sort of line of development at an architectural scale, which is really exciting for us. It may not be for others, but for us it's very exciting. And so it's proved to be almost a rejuvenator for a practice that's been around for a long time. And so we're now trying to bring all of that knowledge and process and different way of developing projects into the mainstream of our office. And certainly our office is a big studio space where everybody sees all of this stuff and sees these things being made and tried. Not everybody is participating in them because somebody has to earn money, but it really has been good for the office. And so it's proved to be, I think, a real shot of energy for us. Yes.
Billy, is that you? Yes.
Thank you, John, for the beautiful lecture. It was so interesting to me to see the houses and how they change from place to place. And so I'm wondering, as they're so different, is there anything in your mind that makes them the same?
Yes. I think they all share scale. For us, we are very concerned to keep the scale of the projects. Human scale is meaningless, but we're really concerned about intimacy, about the projects not becoming overblown. So scale is one thing that is the same in all the projects, but because the projects are so formally and materially different, you don't necessarily perceive that. I think the response to the topography of the site is a characteristic of all those projects. The way in which we use natural light is the same. I mean, all of the sort of the intangibles are the same. It's the tangible dimensions of the project which change. And really, I think it's the intangibles which are what you're really trying to create. That's the objectives in the end. And so that is constant through the projects.
Some more questions? Well, thank you. I'll join Billy saying it was a beautiful lecture and inspiring. And let's that poor guy who made that thing, he can't barely lift a glass in that shelter.
Which one? Oh no, it's quite large actually inside.
Really?
Yeah,
You sure? Enough for?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll
Yeah.
test it upstairs.